If you've been walking through a silent season, this message is for you. Not the kind of silence that's peaceful, but the kind that made you question if heaven still remembered your name. If you've ever cried in the dark, wondering if your prayers were echoing into emptiness, lean in. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't just encouragement, it's revelation. It's confirmation for your spirit and clarity for your next step. They thought you were buried, but heaven knew you were planted. What looked like silence was never neglect. What looked like delay was never denial. While others were watching for signs of life above ground, something sacred was happening beneath the surface. You weren't forgotten, you were being formed. And now the shift that heaven whispered in secret is about to make noise. Let me speak this clearly and prophetically. You didn't miss it. You didn't ruin it. You didn't fail. What you sowed in tears, you're about to reap in joy. The pressing, the pruning, the stretching. It wasn't punishment. It was preparation. Because when God moves, He doesn't need applause. He births greatness in stillness. And Isaiah 60 verse 22 rings true like a trumpet. When the time is right, I, the Lord, will make it happen. You see, this isn't just a breakthrough. This is the revealing. This is where all of heaven leans in to watch what obedience produces. Not because you did everything perfectly, but because you refused to quit. When it was dark, you stayed planted. When it was quiet, you stayed faithful. When it was lonely, you stayed aligned. And that kind of trust doesn't just move mountains, it multiplies miracles. Let me remind you, the silence was not God ignoring you. It was Him refining you. He was turning down the volume of the world so you could hear the whisper of destiny. Habakkuk 2 verse 3 says, "Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay." And now it's here. Not because you forced it, but because you endured it. You aligned with heaven when it didn't make sense, and heaven remembers. You didn't fall off, they just stopped watching. But God never took His eyes off you. While people were busy counting you out, God was counting you in. He was shaping something eternal, something weighty, something royal. This is not your comeback. This is your coronation. You are stepping into what was always yours, except now you carry it with the strength of someone who has been through the fire and came out fragrant, not burned. Some thought you had given up, but you were going deeper. The root system God built in your spirit in the dark is why you will not be shaken in the light. Like bamboo, your growth seemed invisible until suddenly it wasn't. You didn't just survive, you evolved. And not with chaos or panic, but with divine strategy. You knew the wind was speaking even when the path was still. And now the very atmosphere is changing to make way for your arrival. I declare to you today, you won. Heaven already settled it. The evidence is just catching up to the victory that was already written. Your glow isn't for applause, it's confirmation. Your peace isn't passivity, it's power. And that unsettling you felt months ago, that was heaven shifting the ground beneath your feet so your roots could stretch deeper for the weight you were born to carry. Romans 8 verse 18 gives us the framework for this moment. The sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed. You are not entering this season as the same person who cried through the last one. Something in you broke open. And what came out wasn't just pain, it was purpose. So let this be your declaration. Whatever I did in faith, it worked. Whatever I pressed through, it mattered. And whatever I surrendered, heaven multiplied. I am no longer waiting for permission to rise. I am rising. I am no longer questioning if I'm enough. I am chosen. I am no longer surviving. I am reigning. This is not wishful thinking. This is spiritual reality. The shift has already occurred. The only thing left now is for the world to witness what God already settled. Friend, They didn't see it coming because they were watching the wrong thing. They were studying your steps, waiting for a stumble, unaware that you had already moved to a higher plane. They expected a battle, but you had already surrendered the fight to God and stepped into victory before the scoreboard even updated. You didn't just win, you transcended the game. And in doing so, you changed the narrative entirely. You didn't respond with noise, you responded with growth. You didn't need to shout back, prove yourself, or retaliate. Because when God is the one preparing your table, you don't need to argue about your seat. Psalm 23 verse 5 tells us plainly, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." That means your presence, calm, collected, secure, is itself a declaration of victory. Not just because you overcame the situation, but because you outgrew the space where the battle first began. You didn't need their applause. You didn't even need their understanding. What you needed and chose was alignment with the heart of God, and that has made you unstoppable. Let me say this with clarity: you didn't break, you built. While others were measuring success by visibility and noise, you were in the secret place drawing blueprints with your tears, framing your future with your prayers, and laying bricks with every silent act of obedience. Every delay fertilized your discernment. Every betrayal redirected your focus. And when the pain came, you didn't let it crush you, you let it instruct you. You turned grief into grit. You turned sorrow into strategy. That's not just a win, that's spiritual maturity. That's kingdom elevation. People assumed your silence was weakness. They thought you had lost your voice. But you weren't mute, you were measuring. You weren't confused, you were calibrating. And when the time came, you didn't rise with vengeance. You rose with vision. You didn't climb to prove a point. You climbed because you knew the view from obedience would be worth it. There is no louder statement than a life that radiates peace while others are still trying to provoke a reaction. You made pain your blueprint. You turned what was meant to break you into the very thing that built you. And like Job, you learned to walk forward in faith even when answers were absent. Job 23 verse 10 captures it so well. "But he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I will come forth as gold." That's who you are now. Refined, not rattled. Polished, not panicked. Not just because you went through the fire, but because you yielded to the process. The flames didn't consume you. They completed you. And while they were waiting for you to come back swinging, you were becoming someone who no longer needed the fight to validate your worth. That's what happens when you learn how to suffer well. That's what happens when eternity outweighs ego. 2 Corinthians 4 verse 17 reminds us that our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. What you went through may have felt heavy, but the glory that it unlocked is eternal, permanent, non-negotiable. You're not walking around trying to prove you made it. You are the proof. You didn't just survive disappointment, you were discipled by it. You didn't just endure shaking you. Let the shaking refine your foundation. You became unshakable because you stopped resisting the seasons that were meant to rewire your soul. The pain forced you to pay attention to the patterns. The silence taught you to discern the signals. The darkness made your inner light undeniable. And because you learned to walk by faith and not by sight, your elevation didn't need to be loud, it just needed to be real. So here you are. No grand announcement, no need for applause, just a presence that shifts the atmosphere. Just a posture that says, I've already inherited the outcome. They didn't see it happen. They only feel the difference. You don't need to wave the banner of victory. You are the banner. Heaven never needed a mic drop, just your obedience. And while the world measured your power by noise, heaven measured it by surrender. They thought silence meant you lost. They thought your stillness was weakness. But silence in the hands of a child of God is not retreat. It's strategy, soaked in surrender. The kind of surrender that doesn't wave a white flag, but instead raises holy hands to heaven and says, "Lord, this one is yours." You didn't fight for attention. You didn't plead for justice. You didn't dirty your hands to prove your purity. And because you didn't become them, you didn't forfeit your anointing. Some battles aren't meant to be fought. They're meant to be walked past. You weren't passive. You were poised. You stood in the fire and didn't flinch. Not because it didn't burn, but because your peace was built on a different altar. Exodus 14 verse 14 became your reality. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Stillness is not weakness. Stillness is power under command. It is the discipline to trust that heaven keeps better records than your emotions ever could. Let's call it what it is. Retaliation is for the unhealed. Those who still bleed from unprocessed wounds will always reach for the sword. But you reached for the cross. You remembered that vengeance doesn't heal, resurrection does. And every time you chose grace over gossip, clarity over clapping back, dignity over drama, you were choosing the higher road. You weren't trying to win an argument. You were protecting your realm. And because of that, God didn't just vindicate you, He established you. You didn't just walk away. You walked forward. You chose to not match their energy because your oil was too expensive to waste on petty wars. While others fought for control, you yielded to God's timing. And instead of losing influence, you were handed authority. They don't realize that what you inherited was not position, but spiritual jurisdiction. You don't just walk into rooms, now you shift them. Why? Because your silence wasn't a void. It was a vessel, and God filled it with weight. When God calls you higher, He doesn't just ask you to step up. He asks you to step different. You refuse to stoop just to survive. You didn't mimic their methods. You didn't echo their insults. And in doing so, you didn't just preserve your name, you preserved your future. There's a cost to that kind of restraint. It's painful to stay quiet when your flesh craves release, but it's divinely profitable. As Jesus said in Matthew 5 verse 10, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." You were blessed not because you were passive, but because you were righteous when it was hard. They looked for the fire in your words, but they missed the fire in your soul. The refusal to retaliate wasn't cowardice, it was courage. It was spiritual maturity.